Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. As I read this gospel passage, I started to think, what is it that is key for today? What is it that can give us help and hope, a way forward? And so the first thing I did is I went back in Matthew's gospel to see what has happened just before this particular passage, and I went forward. And as I went back, I saw a theme of Jesus turning the world topsy-turvy. So in about the middle of chapter 16, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they go through that conversation of who they think Jesus is. And at the end of that, Jesus predicts his death. And he says, whoever wants to save their lives will lose it. And whoever loses their life for my sake will have life. There's other parts in there. There's where the children come to Jesus. And that's in amongst a talk about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus says, this child in its humbleness is the greatest in the kingdom. We fast forward a little bit to just before what happens today. And in that, we have the landowner going to the marketplace in the morning to find laborers for his vineyard. And he hires people and realizes it's not enough. So he keeps going back and going back throughout the day to hire more people. And then at the end of the day, the people who have worked just an hour get as much as the people who have worked a full day. And of course, there's a lot of disgruntlement. And the landowner's reply is, it's my generosity. It's up to me to be as generous as I choose. And after that, Jesus does his third prediction of death. And it's right after that third prediction of Jesus dying that the mother of James and John comes with their sons and says, ask for positions of honor. Now, of course, the disciples get all upset because that John and James didn't get what Jesus has been trying to tell them, but because they felt that they were equally entitled to those positions of honor. So whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. I've seen memes on Facebook where it says, the CEOs of companies and all these top people, the people that we looked up to as successful, they have to stay home. But the people who are out there are the people who serve. There are maintenance workers. There are restaurants workers. All these people in places of serving are doctors, are nurses, are LPNs, are maintenance people in the hospital. These are all people who haven't stayed home. They go out and they serve. Service, we tend to have a problem with service, and it's not that we don't do it. We do. I've seen it. The problem is that quite often the only people we want to serve are those we know, those we understand, those we're close to. And if we're going to serve other people, we're going to do it from a distance. We're maybe going to send money, or we're going to do it where we don't have contact, face-to-face contact or conversation with people. Now, as many of you know, I was a waitress in my earlier years up until sometime in my 30s. I've worked in both truck stops, I've worked in restaurants, I've worked in lounges, I've worked in bars. And what I found as I started my journey to the priesthood was that there was no better training for me as a priest than being a waitress. I would have to get to know my regular customers. I would know the order, their regular order. I could almost, as soon as I saw them come in a door, say, I need that order. This is it. I would talk to them, and they would share with me their lives as much as they were willing. And each time they came in, I would have a conversation with them. How's it going? How's this situation? Is it better? I would show that they were important to me. And hopefully I showed that they were important to me, not for the income they brought into the restaurant, which paid my wages, or for the tip they might leave me, but because I, as their server, cared who they were. I worked in a little lounge in Saskatoon in 1979, and that is my first experience of drawing people together as community, as forming community from people who aren't necessarily all on one page as far as what they do for a living, as far as how they live their lives. And so I had a table where this one young gentleman, a little bit older than me, would come in and he would sit. And through time of talking to him, I found out that he'd been transferred to Saskatoon from Toronto with the bank. And he was really struggling. Now, this man was extremely intelligent, and his conversation reflected that. And I think with that and the fact that he was very much an introvert, he found it hard to meet people. And so when I had time, I would sit at the table with him and I would listen to him and try my darndest to understand what the heck he was saying. But I would focus on him and make him feel that he was important and that I cared. So at another table, off against the wall, was a woman who was an alcoholic. And there again, I spent time with her. I listened to her. I cared. And then there was a table closer to the bar, and two construction workers sat there. And they didn't necessarily have any struggles, but they weren't from Saskatoon, so they didn't know a lot of people, and they had chosen to make this particular lounge their go-to place. And so I would also spend time talking to them and listening and learning about who they were and caring about the things that they said. We formed community. And yes, I was a server in the sense that I served them their drinks, or if they ordered food, I served them their food. But I was also a server in that I listened to them. I spent time with them. These are just 4 members of the community that was formed, and they're the ones I remember. Service is a face-to-face contact. It's caring. It's listening. It's not going out and doing for so much as it is journeying with. It's helping. It's not taking over. It's helping. It's giving a step up, a journey beside, helping find the resources. In many ways, it's not that hard to do. And yet we're so afraid of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we think we're going to make a mistake and be judged. This time of social isolation, we struggle because we can't see our families. And but for those of us that are grandparents, let's think of a recent picture of our grandchildren, or of a niece or a nephew, or of a child at any rate. I just received a video and a picture of my 3-year-old granddaughter yesterday. The video was her going down the street on a bike that doesn't have pedals, and her laughter just trilling out over the neighborhood. And then the picture was of her splashing in the mud puddles, the simple joys of childhood. The other picture that I received was of my baby granddaughter fussing, and the family dog had come and was trying to comfort her. And the only way that the dog had of comforting her was by laying with her and placing its head on her body and letting her know that it cared. and letting her feel the concern. Jesus tells us that the greatest are like a child in their humbleness, in their simplicity. We don't have to do great and amazing things. We need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to caring. That's how the early church grew. This time that we have of social distancing, of self-isolation, this time that we have gives us plenty of blocks of time on our hand. And maybe you're like me and you struggle to find things to do in these blocks of time. When I shut down the computer for work for the day, what do I do now? Part of what we can do is to take the time to look at the world as it was becoming, and seeing with clearer eyes, with fresh eyes, because now we can step back to see with clearer, fresh eyes, what was the path that we were on. And we can do that while looking at the scriptures and looking at God's vision for the world. And when we do that, we're going to find that there's a total disconnect, that the world wasn't on the path that Jesus has taught us, that we as a society were not promoting service, but rather individualism and people meeting our needs and our needs coming first. So we have this beautiful space of time where we can sit back and envision the world in light of the scriptures, in light of Jesus' teaching, in light of the prophets. We can envision that world, and we can see the disconnect between the world as it is. We sit there and think, what needs to happen? And the first place to start is within ourselves. What needs to happen? What reality checks do I need? What needs to change within me, within my attitude, within my responses, so that we can make a way forward to living in the kingdom? And we can start with all this time that we have. We can start self-correcting ourselves, our attitudes, our thoughts, our actions. And while we're doing that, we can also start to think, what does that mean for the wider world? What needs to change in the wider world in order for us to be able to live into the kingdom that Jesus speaks about in the Gospels, that kingdom that God has planned from the beginning of time? And we can start finding resources. We can start planning, how are we going to live in the world in a way that lives into the kingdom? So we have this gift of time, and we have the scriptures, and we have Jesus telling us that whoever wants to be great among us must first of all be a servant, and whoever wants to be first among us must first of all be a slave.